First off, I'd like to greet everyone and wish everyone a very happy Guru Purnima. And it gives me immense pleasure to be part of this webinar today on such an auspicious occasion. Thank you, Vishwa Talks and Parampara, for organizing this. Jayachandranji and I have known each other for quite a while, and we've often had these informal conversations on just such subject matters. And these conversations run for hours. And rarely have I left having met him without some nugget of information, which has enriched me, or a fresh perspective on these matters. This talk is by no means exhaustive. It will be, and we are not going to be covering the archaeological or the architectural facets of temples. It is very, very specific and focused on the purpose of temples only. And of course, there is only so much we can cover in half an hour. So it is, like I said, it's not going to be comprehensive, but will serve to perhaps give you a tiny peek into the wealth of information that there is. Why it is important to have this conversation is because, especially in the light of recent events where there have been so many controversies, especially regarding temples. We've had Sabrimala, we've had Shani Singapore, and so on and so forth. So it's important to have these conversations going back and forth for us to decolonize our minds and for us to understand these aspects of our Indic and Dharmic culture with a fresh set of eyes. And that is why these conversations are very important. For example, the colonized minds that we have, we tend to equate temples with churches and mosques in a hurry. But that would be wrong, because the very purpose of temple is not just a prayer hall. And that's what we hope to unveil or reveal today. So to just sort of set the context a little bit before we launch into the talk by JC, in India, we've always had various forms of worship which have run alongside several threads of strands of practices. It's never been chronological or sequential. They've always run alongside. For example, the Vedic period, the altar, the fire altar, was a primary conduit of worship, or the yajna, or the sacrifice. There was no structure or beyond the format of Vedic worship. You had nature worship. You still have nature worship. And if you go to villages today, you have Grama Devatas, which are sometimes ill-defined forms resident on riverbanks or under trees. And there is no structure. So clearly, a structure or an edifice is not preeminent for worship in the Dharmic fold. And that is where we're going to start our conversation today. So JC, if worship is not preeminent, or edifice is not preeminent for worship, then what is the purpose of a temple?
Namaste. And it's so important. Thank you, Pujita, for giving me a very wonderful lead. And it's so important to understand that we use this word temple and mostly associated that with architecture. That has been our, there's a kind of an urgency in it that a temple is generally associated with an architectural structure. But primarily, temple is an idea. It has been an idea in the recesses of this civilization, which has thrived for generations together, for millennia, that particular thought that there is something, energy, which is anadi or independent of adi, a content called adi or source. And there is some entity which is independent of human existence. That is apurusheya. Anadi apurusheya. And there should be some entity which is the cause for all other causes, or the cause which has no furthermore cause. I mean, this particular reflection or this particular query, where it all started, I mean, the inquiry on reality, the inquiry, the questions what this people who lived in this part of the world, today what we call as Bharatavarsha, they have inquired, they have put their questions forward, and they were inquiring on reality. And the answer they got for the cause, the principle of origin, the principle that which orders itself to form the reality around. That cause, they call it as Ishvara. Yes, but where will it get hosted itself becomes a question. So many assumptions or many ideas spring. One of the primeval answer is that it manifests itself as something called the living body itself. In that way, this particular human body itself is called the temple, the alaya. It's an idea to understand that this within this something is residing. I mean, generally, body in Indic context, we have three kinds of sharira we call sthula sharira, which is the gross body, subtle sukshma sharira, which is the subtle body, and causal karana sharira, which is the causal body. People say that is there are something, some entity which is beyond the existence of the three, and that entity which lives beyond the three is not beyond some vertically aligned world somewhere high on top in heavens. It's perhaps within, not without. It's not outwardly, but it's perhaps within in the deeper recesses of memory, in the deeper recesses of imagination, and hardwired, as if it's been hardwired for thousands of years. There's continuous disconnected thread going on. If at all a name been attributed to that particular causal nature, that is Ishvara, and that is living deep within the body, and this manifested body is considered to be the alaya, the temple, the mandira, or the griha, the house, the vilasa, the vihara, where this particular entity is living. That's why one of the great saints called Tirumular in his Tirumandiram says, Ullam Perunkoyil. It's a Tamil poetry written by a great Shaivite monk, a poet, a saint, Tirumular, in his text called Tirumandiram. He says, Ullam, the manas is the Perunkoyil, the big temple. Voon Vudambu Alayam. This particular body, the flesh body, is the alaya. Interestingly, the word alaya means, the word laya actually means to dissolve. Alaya exists expansively dissolving itself. This has a perishable nature. The flesh has a perishable nature. So, Voon Vudambu Alayam. Vallal Piranarku Vai Gopuravasil. He says, for the great realized people, the mouth is the entrance of the Gopura. The Gopura entrance is the mouth. Tella Telindarku Sivan Sivalingam. For the great, learned and the great, the Jiva is the Shivalinga. Kallapulan Aindum Kala Manivilakke. The five sensory organs are the Panchamukha Deepa, which is lit to see the inner recess, to reflect within and to see the inner being living. Ullam Perunkoyil, Voon Vudambu Alayam, Vallal Piranarku Vai Gopuravasil, Tellat Telindarku Jeevan Sivalingam, Kallapulan Aindum Kala Manivilakke. Interestingly, in the Vedanta idea that we also understand, so one something we understand is a temple is more or less equated where there's an Atman and there's something, a body is surrounding around, ideationally. And an interesting thing is, according to Vedanta, that the Atman has two major aspects. It has Adhara and Udhara. Adhara, the lips, Udhara, actually Udhara not necessarily means stomach, it perhaps also means uterus. Actually, to be very frank, even in Tamil, when we say certain, in colloquially, if someone, a woman is pregnant, she is said to say that, to indicate that she's carrying another being within her. They would say she is with mouth and stomach. Rather, they would say ava vayum vayurumaga irukkiral. She is with mouth and stomach, carrying the mouth and carrying the stomach. Even in the temple construction, the two aspects to indicate there is an Atman living within the structure, the Gopura entrance, which is the mouth, and the stomach or the womb or the Garbha Griha is more important. These two symbolize more or less an Atman is residing there. From a text called Mayamata, they say Garbhagara Shirah Proktam. This Garbhagraha of the temple, or the main sanctum sanctorum of the temple, is the head part. As if a temple resembles a lying body, Garbhagraha is the Shiras. Antaralam Galam Tata. The next structure is the Galam. Mantapam cha Mukhe Bahu. That is the Ardhamandapa is the chest. Kukshisyat Mandapo Mahan. The stomach part is the Mahamandapa. Prakaram Janu Jangecha. The Prakara are the hands and the feet. Gopuram Padamevacha. The entrance Gopura is like a feet. Padasyangulah Prokta Gopura Stupa Yastata. The stupas, the pillars in the Gopuras are the finger, the digits of the feet. When we enter a temple, indirectly we are entering into a being's body. And there's another, this is one, so we understand that based on a human body model, temple was architected. Another interesting idea is temple is a place, a micro representation of a macrocosmos. That which is in the under is in the pinda. So the universe is brought down into an we can say it is architectonified into a physical monumentation, into an architectural monumentation. I should also wish to quote that a temple is an eternal war field, a war field between a positive energy and a negative energy. There is an eternal, it's a host where all the energy is getting collected there, and in all the energies in and around the temple gets concentrated there, and there's an eternal friction between the good and the bad. The presence of the divine washes off the negative. Actually, the utsava of a temple is more or less a warfare. That's another, which calls for another explanation. But I'm just giving an explanation that every time we do Harati, we do Utsava, Nitya Utsava, we do daily puja to them, we are warding off negative energy. And a very important aspect is whenever in the Sandhikala, especially we say in a given day, a day is divided into 3 Sandhis, and in each Sandhi is a combination of when the dark and the light meets. During that period, human beings are not supposed to do much activity. They're asked to remain silent, mostly in meditative calmness. That's why these Sandhikalas become, the junction points become important time for prayers. Most of them congregate in front of their altars in their own home, or they congregate in temples. The Sandhya, or the evening Kala, is another second Sandhi, which is very, very important for praying. So where the negative energy is washed off and positive energy is reserved. So temple in idea, it's an imitation of a human body, it's an imitation of a macrocosm and a microcosm. It is also a kind of an imitation of a war field, architectonified into an architecture and a culture in it, and a heritage is a very important inheritance of idea flows through that. So this is temple in its idea.
So JC, you, of course, you've encapsulated briefly how this micro macro gets reflected in the temple architecture, right? When you mention heritage, that is very, very important. How are temples carriers of heritage? Because heritage is really like a blueprint or a code for the manifested form. So how can you tell us, walk us through how it is a carrier of heritage?
See, when I say there's an idea behind a temple, naturally, idea needs an ideology to manifest itself, or to these ideas which is there has to inherit itself into some kind of thought. This inheritance of the knowledge system is what is called as heritage. Inheritance of the knowledge system from some idea, some abstract idea, gets inherited through walking beings like humans. I mean, interestingly, it's based on some principles of knowledge. One of the primeval principles they say is the ancient people built, they thought anything which is of an idea needs explanation, but that explanation should be of alpavakya, less words, but mahartha, should have very, very deep gravitas of the word artha not necessarily means meaning. The word artha also means goal. The goal should be very high, and the main goal they are working towards is to establish dharma. The word dharma is not necessarily, it is little difficult to translate it, but the word dharma is more or less understood as that entity on which every other entity can comfortably sit on, comfortably co-hosted with each other, co-work with each other. Such an entity is called dharma. So to represent dharma, to represent the dharma of the universe itself, they were working on some knowledge system so that these ideas can get explained to everyone. One of the important ideas to, I should also say this, that the main temple constructors were called as Vishwakarmans. The architects, the sculptors, the city designers, the temple designers. I mean, they were the Vishwakarma people who inherited exhaustive amount of knowledge, and their knowledge is entirely based on Vedic studies. For them, in their tradition, any idea can be represented in terms of numbers, numerals, as a count. That count-based mathematics is called Ayadi Ganita. They had an inherited knowledge. From the Vedic knowledge, they were inheriting. That's a heritage. There's a heritage in which they have been converting an idea into a numeric value. Based on the numeric value, they would design a space. They would design an architecture. And what is fundamental to the entire thing is number and rhythm. Interestingly, in Rig Veda, there's a quotation called Ritam Satyam. If at all there is something called Satya, it is Rita. The word Rita in the Samskrita, in the Vedic language, it has not changed even in the Indo-European language, and it gets awarded as rhythm, which means the same meaning as the frequency, that measure in which it occurs itself. So if there is something called Satya, it lies in rhythm. Rita. Rita means order. Actually, in Vedic language, the word Rita means order. Order is truth. Order is Satya. I don't want to even translate Satya. Our order is Satya. Now, based on this ordering, they would identify something is getting manifested, can be calculated, and we exhibit it as a visual medium. This visual medium in its fundamental has rhythm as its center. There's a spatial rhythm, and temporal rhythm is also required, for which they were seeking help. Performative arts were also incorporated within the structure. For the temporal rhythmic structure, time-based rhythm, performing arts was also part of this entire, the katha recitation, music, dance, theater, also entered into the same installation part. To do spatial installation, painting, sculpture, architecture, these were all part of this entire exercise. But what is fundamental is Rita. The idea of Rita, idea of ordering, idea of rhythm. And that should be of the structure, what they say should be of lesser, it should be less, Alpavakyam. But it should have Mahartha. Within small passages and small work of architecture, the entire cosmos can be folded within it. This requires for a greater knowledge. I also wish to quote that such knowledge not necessarily is always performative. There is no need to always keep constructing temples to constantly keep in touch with the temples, because that is called practice. But at times when practice fails, the inherited knowledge helps us. I'll quote an example here that during the invasions of the Afghan rulers, the Mughal rulers, especially the famous attack of Ulu Khan and in 1321, and earlier the Alauddin Khilji's
Kafur, I think
Malik Kafur's attack. Yeah, so the idea is the Vishwakarmans and many of the artisans and artists of India, especially in South India, many temples were razed to ground, and everything was clear, and they were imprisoned, and more or less they were not allowed to construct for a while. At least for a couple of, not even couple, 2-3 generations, they could not do it. But after 3-4, when Vijayanagara Empire came to power, when they restarted their entire work, believe me, those generations of people have not constructed for 2-3 generations. The temple architecture has not happened. But how did it come back? Because of the inherited knowledge, which not necessarily needs a practice. I mean, there's an inheritance of knowledge in it. I mean, the knowledge of inheritance is so deep that at times we wonder that even while making the Moola Murti, the inherited knowledge in them helps them to identify a stone. From the mountains, they identify the stone part, which part of the mountain this particular stone can be quarried. That itself is spoken to them in terms of inherited knowledge. There are presence of male stones and female stones and napumsaka, or the neuter gender stones. that to do the male devata, only male stones are chosen. To do female devata, female stones are chosen. And to do pillars and steps, neuter gender stones are chosen. And it is so interesting to note the way it is aligned in the nature as a quarried one. That's how it is. It's horizontally, the slab has been quarried out from the mountain. Like literally, we have to understand that we can't make a vertical quarrying and make a horizontal statue, or horizontal quarrying and make a vertical statue. If you're making a vertical one, vertically it has to be quarried down, and whatever the size of the image, thrice of it's been generally quarried. And the Vishwakarman, who has decided to down manifest the energy there, meditates there without there is no connection with him with the temple, nowhere. With his family, I'm saying, he's not connected with the family. He separates himself from the family. He does dhyana, meditation on the undressed rock. And finally, at one particular time, he feels the entire murti has descended within the temple, within the particular stone slab. And his job is to just remove the dirt on top of the stone and relieve the goddess from there. This is absolute inheritance of knowledge. This is heritage. I mean, without this heritage of knowledge, and the Devi need not be of same image. At times, the energy can reveal itself with two bhuja, only dvibhuja image, two shoulder image. It can reveal itself as four shouldered image. The dhyana can reveal with 16 shouldered images. It is not pre-designed. It is from the dhyana. That's why those shlokas are called dhyana shlokas. And this comes out of deeper inheritance. And this leads to an idea called practiced culture. Culture is a place where they practice it. So that is an important link, I would say, that to understand the temple.
And I remember, JC, that you had mentioned, for example, I think a particular temple was at Brihadishwara, where you said that right at the top of the spire,
Absolutely.
there is a sort of a structure where you had, can you maybe talk a little?
In Brihadishwara temple, in the top, in one of my teacher, there are people who taught me about architecture, and generally I keep discussing with them, are Sri Umapati Acharya and Sri Veeranathan Acharya. They are Sthapatis from a very strong lineage, a very, very old lineage of Sthapatis, still living in Kumbakonam, practicing and teaching to many of the people who are requesting them too. Once in their services, once they had to survey the spire, the Sri Vimanam of the famous Brihadishwara temple of Tanjavur during its Kumbhabhishekam. It was said by the Acharya himself to me that once when he was asked to be there, he went to the top, and that's a slab, stone slab that have each Nandi, there are 8 Nandis, they each weighing a couple of tons. That's an architectural marvel to witness, to behold, to believe it, kind of a thing. And interestingly, he kept his hand within the slab. In the other side of the slab, he felt sculpture within it. And it's inside of it. And suddenly he got goosebumps in it, because he says, if not for the sculptor, who would have seen this?
Exactly.
Who would have seen this sculpture? And interestingly, Rajarajan himself would have not seen this. There's no probability for him to see that. And who wants to climb so high to see something within? And why some sculpture, the sculptures were kept on top of this Sri Vimanam, is as perfect as the sculpture which is in the eye level of a viewer. I mean, there is all possible that you can, just because it's not been viewed by anyone, it can be done to any irregular, it can be done to any shape. But then only the entire idea unfolds, that the inherent heritage makes them, the idea of truth, the idea of satya they have taken as a sankalpa, that they would say anything which is blossoming from the tree. It's like several branches of the tree. Any part of the tree, the topmost flower, which is left unsmelt and untouched by a human hand to be offered to a god even, that flower smells as delicate and perfumed like the lowest branch flower, which is being taken for consumption of a human being or even for a god worship. That just because the flower is on top of the branch, that does not mean it is not less perfumed or less colorful. The manifestation of truth across the system is even, and that comes because of a central understanding of the idea what a temple is. And that comes because of a huge practice culture.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so this is like, for example, so this leads me to the next question, that We've talked about heritage. We've talked about how this is a very, very intrinsic part. And heritage is like a blueprint or a code. It's a genetic code, really. I think you cannot, just ask a layperson to pick up a knowledge tradition and say, oh, I just learned this for 2 years and I learned temple architecture for 2 years and I'm building a temple. These are things that take years and years and years of assimilation. So we have that on the one hand. So temple being the, let's say, the genetic or the source code. Culture would probably be the manifested form of heritage.
Absolutely.
Now we have so many, we know that temples have always been associated with so many knowledge traditions, knowledge systems, and temples in their fold, sustained large number of people of all kinds, right? Practicing different things. So can you just talk a little bit about how temples have been centers of various things, not not just worship, but so many different things, different aspects of culture.
But interestingly, the word culture means actually the equivalent to word culture in Sanskrit is Sanskriti. Nature is called Prakriti. Nature as opposed to nurture. Nature as opposed to culture. Nature is Prakriti, culture is Sanskriti. What is culturing? Recreating nature in a controlled environment. I mean, argument's sake, if we recreate a natural forest in a controlled environment, it's called agriculture. Correct. And we create pearl sericulture or horticulture. The word culture means recreation of something which is of Prakriti into a Sanskriti model. In that sense, recreation of the cosmos into something, recreation of a human body into some. These are all several cultural culturing. Through imagination, through memory and through imagination, you're culturing it back. And you need various professionals to do that. That's why temple is supposed to be one of the most elaborate of the corporate bodies we can ever imagine, because temple perhaps is the only corporate body we understand, perhaps is the only corporate body we understand that can hire the most erudite scholar, a logician, a language expert, to a philosopher, to a thinker, but to the lowest rung, and also hire a barber to itself. Temple like Brihadishwara temple had barbers as employees. Srirangam still has. The big temples of Madurai and Chidambaram also has them. They are temple barber. There is no one profession. There are even professions in temples like Tiruvarur where there are traditional people who fold papers to decorate the temple chariot during the Terotsavam, or during the Tiruteru, during the Brahmotsavam. People were traditional peoples who know how to tie or fold the papers and decorate. They paper folders, people weavers, jewel makers, potters, textile, obviously. And it's so essential that every corporate body, everything is a cultural representation of the idea. But one interesting thing which most of us kind of overlook is all these societies, they are individual artistic societies. They were professional societies, but artistic society, working in tandem with each other, working in response with each other's aesthetics, working in response to each other's with sensitivity, all catering to one particular idea called the primeval god there. Yes. Interestingly, there is a kind of a very layman viewpoint that if there's a textile woven, it is draped on the god or for the god. The jewel is made, it is for the god. There is an idea called for the food is cooked, it is for the god. But if you carefully inquire within the society, they would say it is not for the god, the food itself is the god.
Oh, right. That's interesting.
For the people who are cooks, the traditional temple cooks, that pot, that particular brass vessel with the cooked food, that itself is done avahana. That itself is puja is offered to say God not necessarily resides in the body of a stone. He resides within this annam. Then parallelly, when a weaver makes it, within the textile is not going to drape only the stone image, but the textile itself is the body of the god. The jewel, see, it is like multiple bodies, body within body, body draped on the body. I mean, when a priest recites a mantra, it's called the mantra sharira. Not necessarily it's an attribution to the god. The mantra itself take a shabda sharira, kind of a nada sharira. That itself is a body. When a singer sings, that takes a composition is a body by itself, is a divine body. A dancer,
raga
itself is a divine body. Tala is a divine body. A dancer, when they dance, they create a body through themselves. Not necessarily the body is getting offered to the god. A dancer moves without their knowledge. The hastas and the mandalas, what they take, creates a divinity within themselves. That's why you would understand there are a huge body called a temple or a site within which many other bodies are coexisting and in tandem, and all are tied to one particular idea. This is a very intrinsic and a very, I would rather say, active culture, which is multi-layered, one on top of the other. And all of them are surviving with an idea called, even Utsava, celebration is a part of a culture. It's a culture. We are culturing many things within it. If you have to understand, Utsava is essentially a part where the negative energies are getting warded off every single day. There are 8 kalas in a given day. Out of the 6 kalas are occupied by doing pujas. It's called Nitya Puja, Nitya Utsava. We do haratis, Mangala haratis. Every day, it's that during that particular time, the negative energy pervades, and while doing harati, it's warded off. Once again, the volume of the negative energy increases. We do puja to the main deity, it wards off. There are Nitya Utsava, and there is Vara Utsava, there is Masa Utsava, there are Varshika Utsavas. Every time the calendar goes, the negative energy tries to occupy, it has been unhealed. There's a culture there. There's a culturing of the mind to recreate something cosmic here. I mean, the idea of a temple is also, it is beyond. We clearly understand there's so many intricate layering. And I still remember at once, Umapati Acharya, once we were talking to him, he said, ultimately, I was asking, what is a temple? He said, temple is a visual commentary on the Veda.
Wow, that's amazing.
Because then what is Veda? Once again, he got back to the crux of the matter. He said, Veda is a collection of vidhis. Vidhis, as we may call it as rules or whatever, vidhi. But what is the nature of the vidhi? Anadi apurusheya vidhi. Anadi, those vidhis or orders which does not have a cause and which will exist there independent of human existence, which will be there in the cosmos. Even the last man is not here, gets extinct here. These orders will exist in the cosmos. If there's a collection of such orders, that's called Veda, and so forth. Veda not necessarily can be pronounced only in the language. It can be felt. Someone can see it. That's why Veda mantras are called Drishtant. No one says this Rishi wrote it. They say he had a vision of the Veda mantra. So ultimately, to understand, this is far beyond only worship. It's a flow of, there's a rationale behind investigating what reality is. People have been inquiring it for several centuries. What are these reality comprises of? How can it manifest itself down? What are the energies which are getting manifested? Where it can be logged, and how can it work for Loka Kalyana? How it can work for the universal good? So these are various queries they have been addressing and answering. And many other, these artistic societies, they were storehouses of the ideas. It gets transformed into ideologies through their heritage and through their practice. So it gets cultured, and it is getting exhibited through various other facets as worship and also worship. I'm saying also worship.
Also, not just, not just.
And there are so many representations waiting for us. But interestingly, none of them have contributed to the temple that people will come and understand it and henceforth worship it. There is no idea of understanding, intellectualization. If anyone enters into this installation, they will get the benefit
part
of it.
Exactly.
You just get the benefit of it. You get the phala.
Yes. You don't have to intellectualize and understand the process and therefore benefit. Yeah.
See, that Loka Kalyana idea, that let all the intellectuals come together so that they would create a spot of installation that anyone who's uninitiated can also get the maximum phala out of it. I mean, to me, it is one of the grandest ideas of Loka Kalyana, which has survived for many generations. It has been one of the corporate bodies whose major idea is to uphold the dharma of the Loka, of the universe, of the Vishwa. And to say, perhaps this is how the universe is functioning even today. And that's why, and the ultimate essence of the Mula Devata is Rasa. Raso Vaisaha. He is Rasa himself. He is essence himself getting embodied down.
I believe the term rasa appears quite a few times in the Vedas too.
Absolutely. This is a quote from Veda. Raso vai saha, so vai rasikaha. He is the rasa. He is the rasika.
Yeah.
I mean, in this way, we understand that a temple is far beyond. Oh, it is beyond. I don't use far beyond, but it's certainly beyond worship.
Certainly beyond.
There is it's a vault. It's an inherited vault of heritage and culture in it. So, saying this.
Thank you, JC. I think we can probably, that was, I mean, like I said, this talk by JC would only give you a very, very teeny tiny peek into a world, a wealth of, of what is out there. We've merely scratched the surface today, and there's only so much we can do, unfortunately, in 40 minutes. But I do hope that this, I know JC was curtailing himself because, to listen to him, you need at least 2-3 hours, and that I think would probably do justice to him and to the subject itself, but maybe for another day. So I do hope that you enjoyed the talk, and I think he said it all. I don't think I need to summarize anything. We've established clearly that temples have been structures that are not just limited to worship, and they go way beyond that. In terms of energy, in terms of activity, in terms of knowledge traditions, and so on and so forth. So with that, I think we can probably, Shivani ji, open up the forum for questions.
Can concept of temple be used in mosque for Muslim and church for Christian and any other religion apart from Hinduism?
Good question.
Oh, good. Interestingly, the idea of architecture, see, by the pretext of using the word church and mosque, we are not just referring to the architectural principles. For the reason, if at all we only rely on the architectural principles, I would say yes. World across, this inquiry has been there. World across, spanning across Egyptian, pyramids to spires, the tallest spires of the West, the churches, everyone had this inquiry on reality. I mean, Isaac Newton, or the reality, what he found out being the financial minister of London, and his contribution to the Christian theology, even in terms of the writing of Theodicy, his own writing on Principia Mathematica. I mean, most of us know Newton contributed 80% of his work on spirituality, and only less than 20% is on whatever we call as science.
Science, yeah.
And most of these thinkers of the past, many people the old Saint Augustine, I'm saying Reverend Father Augustine, many people have contributed their knowledge, and their ideas has been very universal across the globe. There is no doubt. But the moment practice enters, the moment there is something called time-based understanding of religion. Religion also evolves. Religion certainly takes something very sensitive, something desensitized. Religion is another discussion altogether. The moment we want to marry this an architecture with the practice of religion in it, and I'm sure most of us know certain Islamic architectures were converted into Christian architectures later by certain invaders, and Christian architectures have been converted into Islamic architecture by certain invaders. Islamic, and certain things have happened, even whatever we call as Buddhist been converted into Hindu architecture, Jain structures been converted to Hindu architecture. Architecture does not depend. Architecture is idea based. That's why I told it's beyond worship. Architecture and the principle of installation is beyond worship. It's something to do with idea. But if we want to associate some religion to the structure, well and good. It can be.
That has already been done. I mean, you've had, for example, in Turkey, the Hagia Sophia,
Exactly. Hagia Sophia is a classic example.
So there are so many structures which have been used by other religions. Clearly, that's not a problem. That can be done. But it can be done. Yes, the fundamental core that cannot be replicated.
The idea is lived. The idea what I spoke initially is independent of religious thinking. I mean, in that sense.
So next question, we have the statues for every god and goddesses in our temples, but why do we have only the lingam for Lord Shiva?
Okay. Linga, once again, I would just want to open up something on this icon and linga. Linga is not necessarily for Shiva. There is Vishnu Linga, there is Devi Linga, there is Ganapati Linga. Linga is for whatever gods. Many example for Vishnu Linga, we find it in Nepal, and Devi Linga, Sharada, Sharadamba in the banks of Tungabhadra. In Kollur Mookambika also, there's a Linga Pratishtha of the Devi. And Linga, goddess as there is Linga, there are many places, sites we find it. Linga as an idea, so the word Linga itself has more than, at least documented more than 45 meanings according to one particular text, and some quotes even 122 meanings for the word Linga. To hit it on the nail head, there in architecture and iconographically, there is the only question is whether are we representing something in the Moola Garbhagudi, the Garbhagriha. When it comes to Shiva, or when it comes to the representation of Shiva in the, that is called Rupa Rupa Pratishtha. There is something called 3 types of representations: Arupa, Rupa Rupa, and Rupa. Arupa is as they are manifested in the nature. Rupa, that doesn't have a Rupa. Like mostly they are represented in the form of space, Akasha, Vayu, Agni, Apaha, Prithvi, or in terms of sound, in terms of light. This is called Arupa Pratishtha. Then there is Rupa Rupa Pratishtha, which is in terms of a linga. Then there's a Rupa Pratishtha, which is in the form of the sculptures, or whatever we call as the icons. I had to say this: any of the sculpture is a representation of light. One has to understand a sculpture is a sculpture only from its exteriors. The interiors are hollow. Technically, the interiors of a sculpture is hollow. The exterior, only when light falls on it, we know what is the rupa on top of it. Light is a prerequisite to identify a sculpture. And I ought to say, to know what is the intent behind the sculpture, visual, no great exponent in a sculpture would see a sculpture and be happy about it. If there's a Sthapati, they would touch the sculpture and see the entire coded message of a sculpture is available in the strokes of the chisel, not in the visual. I mean, there are sculptures for us, all of us. I'm making a demarcation here. And in short, I'm making a statement. Majority of the Shaiva temples, the main Garbhagudis of the Linga, the reason it's not necessarily mythological, but that structure allows that architecture to distribute energy very, very harmoniously. Rather, it is not necessarily the only representation. If you go to Chidambaram, in Chitsabha, the Nataraja, bronze is there.
Correct.
I mean, in Tiruvaru Tyagaraja Swami, there is a bronze of the Tyagaraja Swami there. There is always a Linga Pratishtha there, but this has taken far more, precedence. In that sense, I wish to draw your attention that Murtam, that's the Rupa and the Arupa has been taken for different reasons. They take the precedence in a temple. That's a completely different discussion. I'm not getting into it, why that is taking, but I'm just informing you all the 3 are there and all of them are representations of light. The word Chitra, we generally say as painting. There are even temples where it had paintings on the walls and we've been worshipping it. The word Chitra not necessarily means painting. The word Chitra is so interesting. It means the reason behind the radiance or the cause behind the radiance is called Chitra, or it more or less associated with the word of astonishment. That's why the word Chitra with a prefix V becomes Vichitra. Vichitra means to do with it's astonishment. Chitra, the Chitra is not painting. The source behind, the causality to the radiance is called Chitra. So sculpture is called Chitra Abhasa, that which has the interior solid, but exterior is radiating. Chitra Abhasa sculpture. Anyway, I hope I answered it in a very shorter thing. It needs a lot of explanation. Next question, please.
Yes. Could you please repeat the reference from where you quoted the shlokas correlating to body and temple?
Yes, this is mentioned by a poet, a saint poet, Shaiva saint poet. He's a Tamil poet. His name is Tirumular, and he wrote from a text called Tirumandiram. And the second one, what I quoted, Garbhagara Sharaf Proktam, is from Maya Matam, a text of architect. It's a Shilpa Shastra, one of the Shilpa Shastras, imbibed by the Shilpis, the traditional Sthapatis, Maya Mata. The second quotation is from Maya Mata. Ritam Satyam is from Rig Veda, and Alpavakya Mahartham is once again from Rig Veda.
Does the architecture of worship place in itself carries the idea of meditation?
Absolutely. You answered it. Yes. I had to say that a temple is getting consecrated. The sacred water, the Ganga, whatever we take the Ganga Jala, all the water of all the sacred nadis put together, we don't pour the water on the Moola Garbhagudi's image. We pour it on the top of the Kalasha of the architecture. Kumbhabhishekam water is poured on the architectural structure. The structure itself is divine.
It's divine, yeah.
It's divine. It's not necessarily the Moola Murti. It's actually the main spire, the main Vimanam. So lingas, as you say, there is something called Ati Sukshma Linga. The main Gopuram is called Ati Sukshma Linga. See, Ati Sthula Linga, sorry. It's called Ati Sthula Linga. And there's a Sthula Linga, which is the main Vimanam. Sukshma Linga is the central Linga in the Garbhagudi. There is Mantra Linga, which is the priest himself. He is called Mantra Linga. And the Balipeetam is called Bhadra Linga.
Imagine.
So there are many linga. The priest himself is called as Mantra Linga.
Mantra Linga. Yeah.
And there is a very interesting representation as Nitya Linga, who is the temple dancer.
Wow, lovely. Lovely, lovely.
She is always, you can't even separate the linga from her.
So this goes to dispel, the very Western Occidental view of the linga as being representative of the male organ, which is how it is discussed everywhere, right? And look at how
interestingly
it is.
But it is. I see there is only the way we are seeing at one entity is what we are. So how are we reading it?
Yeah.
How are we reading the union of a male and a female principle itself? What is associated with it? See, first of all, it is not it. First of all, there is associated with that is okay. That's a completely different idea. But how are we associating the idea of a uterus? How are we associating the idea of a birth, the garbha, the idea of union? I think certain cultures have evolved itself so much
beyond, yes,
yeah, because
beyond gender.
So much of it. I mean, it has seen so much of these particular things to be little finicky about these things. To me, it's very finicky. I mean, it is so important, so significant, but it not necessarily would draw attention towards that aspect of.
Yes.
See, it is important. It's something very, very important, which is the source of origin. It is worshipable. It is respectable. It's reverential.
Yes.
So in that way, I think these civilizations, older civilizations, are little given up cases. Even it cannot titillate them. It can't excite them anymore.
You get caught in these very banal conflicts. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very mundane quagmire.
Lower everything down to gender.
I mean, biological and something. Something. Yeah.
So yes. So can you please elaborate on how the temple is a representation of the cosmos, the universe?
Okay. Sorry, just a minute, please. See, the word universe puts us into a little delusion. I mean, what is universe vis-a-vis a human is a big question. This enigma that it's something is very extremely expansive and we are just nothing in front of this makes us feel extremely humbled. But can there be an earnest effort to negotiate with that infinite? That's the first step people have been thinking. Is there an attempt even? Can we even humbly make an attempt to negotiate with that infinity? The first step they understood is, one thing I'm very happy. I'm not made of a different material vis-a-vis the cosmos. I'm only, me and the cosmos are made of same entities, that much I'm sure. I'm only a folding of space and time available in this particular locus. And within the space and time, I have a janma, I have a jiva, and I have a mrityu. and I don't belong here. I belong something which is eternal is also living me. The same eternity is also there. That much was the first kind of an axiomatic assumption they have made. Without this axiomatic assumption, there is no possibility for them to venture even to measure it. The measurement was relative. You want to understand it, one has to measure it. You measure it, you name it. You name it, you conquer it. Actually, fundamentally, they have understood if there is a connection between the cosmos and the sky and the earth, it's a very interesting thing. The point of connection they have found is, interestingly, the idea of paddy, Vodlu, Nel in Tamil. Because when the sky wants to talk to the earth, vegetation, the Stavara Jangama comes out, the plantation comes out. Out of all the plantation, one kind of a plantation constantly goes into me and gives me energy. And naturally, this body, what I have, is also called as Annamaya Kosha, that which is of Anna, full of food. So first thing is, they understood my energy comes from something called Anna, and that the energy of the Anna is a product of a combination of heaven and earth. Heaven is secretively talking and touching the Mother Earth. I mean, it's the rainfall. It's from the. It's called. It has a very specific, It's called Dvaya Prithvi. Dvaya Prithvi is a term repeated 125 times in Rig Veda. The contact between the heaven and the earth, and the product is the grain. That is the fundamental measure of any given region at one particular point. Leave alone SI systems. A paddy was the perceivable measure. 8 times of a paddy kept close to each other becomes 1 angula of the given region. So angula is not a constant measure across the region. Based on the major paddy's size, it differs. And there's another angular measurement. It's very interesting. When you actually put the thread around the ring finger and you open that measure, that becomes the angula of the person. So based on this as a multiplication factor, some structures are getting constructed. So naturally, if the fundamental arithmetic of it is a confluence of the heaven and the earth, and that heaven is a universe, and this is the earth here. So this is the contact from which they are trying. So I wish that I'm drawing your attention to the same phrase what I told. Ritam Satyam, order is truth. So they are ordering it to find the truth. They are investigating so that it can grow into a 3-dimensional perceivable images. And I had to say, rhythm is the fundamental structure through which even songs are blazed, poetries are sung, music, dance, everything. So naturally, fundamentally, the spatial and the temporal, time-based rhythms, both of them are called as tala. Tala is not necessarily to music and dance and drama. The spatial measurement is also called as talas. Dashatala vigrahas, Navatala, Navatala, Panchatala vigrahas. And so space and time are more or less equated as same. And this way of understanding, I repeat it, human is humble in front of the cosmos, to evade the fear factor, the axiomatic assumption that me and that is made of same fundamental entity. We interact with each other. The interaction point is the paddy. Its multiplication factor is the structure, the music, the dance, and everything. In this way, the universe is negotiable with the human meager existence. So that's my.
So there is Mr. Pisapati Srinivas Garu has raised his hand. Please make your.
Namaste, sir.
Namaste, Namaste, Jayachandra ji. I bow to you for the knowledge that you have. You are ultimate, sir. Great. Actually, my brother is a Agama Shastra Pandit. Actually, he has constructed around 100 temples. So, but I have 2-3 questions. I am not anywhere near to my brother or you also. See, I am basically a software guy. My question is, 3 questions are there. One is about you have been saying temple represents knowledge and all those things.
Yes.
Temple represents, so even our art and culture, Sanskriti and all those things, various dance forms of our heritage and all those things have come from the temple only. That's what I have. Can we say like that? I have read many times.
You're right, sir. Sorry. Please continue, sir. Please continue.
Yeah, that's one question that you can answer it now.
Yes, sir. See, one thing, how do we understand the word temple itself? Yes, art is born from the temple. But fundamentally, the temple, what we are speaking is the human body. Human body is the alaya from which dance comes. Because wherever, see, to say that dance can happen in a temple is an unfalsifiable statement, because it's not necessarily dance should happen within the precincts of a temple. Rather, converse is also true. Wherever we dance, that space is a temple. A temple is created out of the body. A temple, not necessarily a temple monumentation be done only by stones, bricks, and structures. A human body, while drawing graphical patterns around yourself, you're controlling an energy. It's called digbandhana. You do bandhanam. You do baliharanas through your body.
Yes.
And interestingly, without even walls, without architectural structure, a temple is constructed around a dancing space. That's why, sir, most of us know this, that even when there is, sad times in families, I'm saying big families, we all know that when the space is not officially good for some
consecrated.
No, I'm saying even something has happened in the family, some good things, some things, unfortunate things have happened. That year they never had good, agricultural returns. The produce was not great from the family. Marriages were not happening. Those days they used to invite people to do kathas at home. And we used to invite people to do theater. I'm saying our Bhagavatams at home, in the angan, in the courtyard.
Like Burra Kathas and all of these storytellers. Yeah.
Because soon after the katha is over, it is interesting to note the story of a past time is recited to the current time.
Yes.
Where the space and time was harmonized in the past, the story of the time is recited to the time. The story of the space is recited to the space, so that this gets doctored. This gets engineered and reconfigured so that harmony is established back. A very interesting idea of performing is that people used to say, great masters used to say, when we move here, something moves there. That's why we are dancing. We don't dance for audience.
Correct.
When we move here, something in the space moves somewhere there, so that harmony is reestablished in this spot.
Right.
And when we sweat it out here, sweat wipes out the negative. The sweat of an artist, sweat of anyone who does krishi, sir, it has capacity to ward off negativity.
So beautifully said.
Beautiful.
Yeah, that is the power of space, because a sweat itself is idea of a karana, a thought, an idea. Body becomes a temple to work it out as a culture through the knowledge system. Any knowledge system they inherit, but with a great intent. If the intent is right, that sweat can actually wipe negative energy from the place.
Like Prajapati's intense tapas, right? That's how the creation, they say, started. So
see, actually, every one of us inherit that knowledge. So naturally, thank you so much for bringing it, sir, Srinivas sir. That the factor is the krishi itself is alaya. Krishi, the effort what we put,
yes, sir.
The yatna we put. The prayatna is a very important aspect of it, sir. Thank you so
much.
Sir,
one more question, sir.
Yes, sir, please.
It is a taboo question. I don't know whether I not.
Dr. Jayakrishna?
Sunil Patil Garu, can you continue?
Yeah, so just two small minor points I want to ask you as a scholar of temple architecture. The first being that I have heard from several friends and people who visit temples that temples are naturally damp. There is a kind of, the floor is usually wet, it's unclean sometimes. And also the kind of architecture which ensures that the Garbhagriha, it is a very closed, damp space. So my question is there a possibility that the temple architecture can be changed in certain ways going forward, in which you have a wider visual range of... Can you hear me?
Yes, I'm able to.
Yeah, so is it possible that, is it possible going future that the temple architecture can be changed in such a way that there is a larger access in terms of visual access for a larger number of devotees, A, and is it also possible that the kind of scholarly information which you have provided today to us, and which a lot of us in this on this Zoom call keep hearing of, can it be shared in temples across the country? Because many of us, like huge number of devotees and the people visit temples, but then it's just become a kind of a routine without any kind of information about the kind of architecture they're visiting and the kind of structure which even an ordinary temple brings in. The kind of information, is it possible? Do you have, is there any format, is there any architectural entity you have seen which provides this kind of a new age visual delight, and also information wise, it makes it easier for the layman to access the entirety of the wonderfulness of temple architecture.
Thank you, Sunilji. I would attempt to answer the first question. Is
I'm
that,
sorry for the length. Yeah.
No, that's fine. Absolutely. The factor is, I'm not, though I want to answer it in just a couple of questions, just to provoke you, just to make you think, or for all of us to contemplate on it. See, I also mentioned in the earlier part that a temple is like a cohesive architecture. It's like there's a cohesiveness. If there's a measure in ratio and proportion to one part of the temple, that has a connection to the measures of the other part of the temple also. That much we are clear. Because it is like saying, like I'm just trying to draw an analogy that it is like asking, in the entire human body, the eye is very small and it's moist. Can we enlarge the eye? The ratio in which the eye is positioned, or in which it has been designed within the given species being a Homo sapien, it is very definitive in a perfectly done. So Garbhagudi, if you want to expand it, the temple structure itself is far bigger, because it's in ratio and proportion we are expanding. A classic example, if you want to see a very elaborate Garbhagudi, it's Tanjavur Brihadishwara and the Gangaikonda Sodapuram Brihadishwara.
Ranganatha, even Ranganatha Swami?
Yes, in Srirangam Ranganatha, and Padmanabha Swami Kshetram, even in Thiruvananthapuram, the Garbhagudi shape is horizontal. It's like this, like this. If at all we want to have a Garbhagudi like that, then the temple would be exorbitantly big.
Yeah.
It's in ratio and proportion we have to expand. One classic example I can say for the kind of question you have asked is Angkor Wat, where the entire Garbhagudi is big and the structure itself is so sprawling. It is like, such a sprawling structure is possible. Only at that level we can expand the Garbhagudi. Garbhagudi, and it's dark and moist, is perhaps it's also because of our
is it, JC,
yes?
does it have some symbolism to the womb, because it is Garbhagudi?
That's what it's a direct link, as it quoted an eye. It is directly linked to a direct organ is the size of a uterus.
Uterus, yes.
It's always there. The size vis-a-vis the human body structure, if you take, I mean, I'm making a very gross comparison to that, but it's a very ideological comparison, because even the size wise, we can't change it. I wish we had a choice. I wish we had a choice to make something like that, but it is a coherent entity, sir. Second part of your question, second question you asked, there are certain people, there are certain heritage enthusiasts who are trying to make this available online. Certain courses are there running. There are YouTube links, and there are people, some of them have given talks, but there are some books being published on the idea of the temple. Even the inner structure, the interiors are being discussed, but they are not very popular. That much I completely agree with you. Yes, as an effort, all of us have to make an effort to include people of us, people who can write it, publish it. Yes, I completely agree with your intent. The intent is we have to reach it out. Absolutely, sir. I agree with you.
You have just to add this, is there any kind of small sample text available online, just to ensure that the younger generation also is aware of temple architecture?
I can recommend. There are heritage centers. We can just go temple heritage clubs or temple heritage centers. One I can give you, there's a Tamil heritage in Chennai. There's one club, the people, they do a lot of talks regarding temples and architecture. There's another forum running in Bangalore. And then there's one association in Kerala, they do run it. especially if they are based out of Thrissur. They run temple architectures of Kerala kind of forums. You can just, YouTube has a lot of information on this. They are running throughout this lockdown. They had a lot of talks, that much I know. And there is one more forum from Bhubaneswar who are working on the Kalinga style architectures of the Orissa kind region. And one is working out of Orcha, MP, Madhya Pradesh.
Madhya Pradesh.
Yeah, they are working out on the northern. There are people, enthusiasts who are working on these forums. So please, I mean, a judicious thing is YouTube. All of us know.
Yes.
You can just Google it, and we would know that they are working. Regarding books, I certainly recommend you to hear a talk by the Acharya ji, my teacher. I'm saying Umapati Acharya. He gave it for Atharva Forum. Please go through that talk. It's a wonderful talk. It's a 1.5 hour talk. I recommend all of the people who have heard this to listen to it. That's what I would recommend.
I'll take the
Sorry
next.
for the long answers. I have to say this. Yeah.
So we have a few things like the musical pillar at Hampi and the
Yes.
hanging pillar at Lepakshi. Would you please
Yes.
throw some light on this?
Yes. See, one thing is the musical pillar itself is not necessarily exhibitionistic in nature. You know, it's not necessarily like what we say. It is they didn't do it so that someone will come for a heritage walk and they'll keep banging on it, and the guides will bang it
Ultimately
and
destroyed it.
I mean, there are some installations of sound frozen. They are called avaranas. The nada has to be frozen in certain avaranas. There are certain specifications to architecture that the inner avarana, the word avarana means skin.
Veil.
Like it's typically a skin. The word avarana comes from the word of the skin of a paddy. The paddy skin is called avarana. From there, every other term springs out.
Beautiful.
So every other avarana meaning comes out. It is so thick. It is so, see, avarana is not just an enclosure. Rather, it's an organic part of the inner being. I mean, it has sprung from the center. It has been outer. They're not disassociatable. Now, one of the avaranas in the structure is the nada avarana. There, without it is not necessarily installed through pillars in every temple. Without even the presence of the singing pillars, it is installed there. The visual, it's not necessarily visually need to be installed through pillars. It is installed there. We don't perceive it. And I had to say, beyond a point, certain sounds cannot be heard. As in when you go inner and inner, if you carefully watch, certain sound waves gets cut off. Certain light waves also gets cut off. So we are, as in when we are going inner and inner, certain sounds are removed, certain sounds are introduced. They are very technical. It's a sound and light installation. We can't forget it. So more and go inner and inner and inner, the sound becomes extremely unified. Like
subtle, very subtle.
Like one shruti, it goes so pinpointed, look like a shajja in a music. At that level, temple can also be understood as a sonic installation.
Sonic,
as a sound
beautiful.
That's a different argument. But on a simple note, I had to say it is not. So certain temples have the luxury of installing it. Certain people don't have the luxury of installing it. That does not mean sound is not installed there. But coming to the point of the Saptaswara pillars or Saptaswara steps also in certain temples, you should see the engineering in it. It is breathtaking engineering, because there is a damped frequency. There's a natural frequency for the stone, and it has to be damped to another frequency. It's pure physics. I don't want to get into it. It is like solving a 14th order differential equation to find a solution for it, which is, I mean, supercomputers would find it difficult to do it. They have done it. So it is physics. It's absolute physics. We have to understand the material physics behind it. Yeah.
Some promote this wrong narrative that the people who built these beautiful temples and caves were actually slaves, and they were exploited in creating these structures. How can one counter this wrong narrative with proofs?
It's so straight. Just talk to any Sthapati of a traditional family. Just half an hour discussion with them will make us understand how. I mean, I don't know, because there's the only way to understand what these families have done to the face of earth. By way of saying Vishwakarma, I don't just mean Indian Vishwakarma alone. I'm saying the architect idea. I mean, we can't even fathom their idea where something abstract is getting converted into an architecture. The pain of designing it is like unfathomably difficult. And it is not because of intellectual reasoning they arrive upon. It is one faculty which most of us may not believe even today, is the capacity of dhyana. Please talk to the most advanced architect of the current world. They still thrive on focused thought. It doesn't come out of multiple CAD CAM figures or nothing. Design does not come like that. Please talk to designers, top-notch designers of the face of the earth today. Their language we may not be able to understand. The way if they start talking about the design, we think they're talking about something very abstract and something very ephemeral. We don't know what they're trying. Please watch one entire series. I'm giving a very, I would rather say very simple thing, that in Netflix, there is one particular series called on designers, on a costume designer, on an architect, on a web designer. They are all top-notch people in the world. Please listen to their talks. None of the talk revolves around the design, what they're doing. If you want to go and watch a costume designer and see she'll speak something about the costume, she's not all speaking about costume at all. She's speaking about something else. She's speaking about light. She's speaking about cosmos. She's speaking about something else. Then only you understand all of them are speaking the same. Design in principle, architects in principle cannot happen because of force. If at all, because to designers, even today, great designers, even fashion designers, top-notch designers, to them, their design breathes. Their design sweats. They are living entities. To talk to them that your design is like a good cloth, they may even feel offended, because for them it's a living entity, just hoisted on a living some body called model. For them, the costume is far more lively than the model who's carrying it. I mean, I'm not joking. Please listen to any of the designers. A person who designs a chair, for them, that design is breathing. It is not non-living entity to them. And what capacity in the human mind would excite to talk to them, to see some life in it?
And you can't force that. You cannot enforce it with persecution and have somebody come up with such beautiful architecture.
But having said that, is not possible to realize it physically without a labor. The labor part is a judicious sweat and blood part. That is okay. But the primeval aspect of the temple, and even that in terms of temple, the labors were whatever the labor is, they all are Vishwakarmans. They all belong to the family. Everyone had so much of austerity to do what they were doing. And I had to share this. When all of them have constructed that temple, when it is consecrated and given to the society, none of them, especially the head Sthapati and his entire family, would never visit that temple again. Would never ever visit. Not even them. Their generation would not visit that temple. There are many reasons for it. I mean, to call this as a labor is like atrocious. Atrocious. Anyway, it's our lacuna. We would understand it slowly. Even all of us started like that. We learned it. Absolutely.
So well said, Bhai. Next question. In many temples, we have the sculpture of Yali, which was portrayed as a part of lion with a part of elephant. Could you tell us something about it and why it is found commonly across temples?
See, these structures, I mean, even in temple, why are on Yali is a question. How could a woman sit on a lotus? How can a human body have an elephant face? And how can a man lie on a serpent? That too on two wives on his feet doing massage. And serpent having multiple heads spreading out? I mean, a man with a fish lower half of body and a mortal man on the other half, man with a lion face. Why? See, none of this is available in the nature. See, first of all, when we see a lotus in a temple, that has nothing to do with a natural lotus. A lotus by itself is a code. I had to say this. Then Yari is also a code. Whatever a Yari, a Makara has 5 animals confluenced in it. there is one very important quotation it would say, none of them is optical. There is no optical perspective. Everything is cognitive perspective. None of them is optical. Everything is cognitive. Everything is cognitive. There is no physical, there is no creeper there. There is no lotus there. It is creeper-like representation. Lotus-like representation is trying to say something. This is far more what we are trying to infer out of it. And they're not written there for us to go and solve the puzzle. No, they never kept it so that we'll go and decode it and identify it.
It's not a treasure hunt.
Not a treasure hunt. They are there. There are symbols there left to radiate some auspiciousness to us. We pass through that, they give us something. We pass through that knot. If you carefully watch the creeper going there, it will be knotted somewhere. That knot, they have some terms to it. One would call it as Brahma Mudichu. Something is called as some other thing. If you open it up and see, it would be, to my own shock, I found if I've touched one, my teachers would say, go and touch that particular knot there. If you touch it, he said, okay, fine. Then I'll ask them, I'll pick up my confidence. I'll ask them, sir, why did you ask me to touch the knot? It's nothing but it is a point representation of a Rig Veda. A Rig Vedic hymn is said there. Instead of uttering, knowing the thing and uttering, you touch it, you are getting it. I mean, they have done all the krishi for us. To be very precise on the Ayari, what you told, it springs out of someone's dhyana. Yeah. In the dhyana of particular Vishwakarman, of one particular phase, we want to call them as mythical, we want to call them as unrealistic, it's okay. That is what the dhyana, because there's an intent behind the dhyana. You want a representation for the dhyana, you're going to meditation for a mandala, a 40-day mandala, 40 days meditation, 1 year meditation, out of which these images are born out. It is a confluence of many things coming together and it's been solidified. It is, you can decode it. I had to say this. No bull in front of a Shiva temple is actually a bull. If you carefully count the number of teeth, that itself will reveal it is not one bull, it is two bull. It is two. Because you count the teeth there, that is the code. The teeth will show you that it is not one bull.
Oh, wow. Amazing.
And actually the definition of Rishabha Nandi in Veda is Dvimukha. If you carefully watch Nandi in front of Shiva's thing, right side it will resemble one bull, left side you go and see it will resemble another bull. There are two bulls coming together there. It has 3 legs. It has it has 7 arms and 2 wings.
So they say something about the legs of the Nandi with respect to the different yugas, right?
Yes.
So when it is
that
the
is a different thing.
That's a different thing.
That is a different thing. Okay. This Rishabha Nandi, what we see in front of Shiva's temple, there are 5 types of Nandis. I don't want to get into. There's something called Atma Nandi, Soma Nandi, Surya Nandi, Vishnu Nandi, or called as Malvide. There are several Nandis. I don't want to get into the thing of it, but I'm giving to watch. It looks like a bull. If you carefully dismantle visually, it anatomically looks like a bull. But one who knows a bull goes close to it and knows something about bulls and cows. They go and see that they know it is not a bull. They alone know it is not a bull.
It is not a bull, but it's 2 bulls.
Because we are too removed from animals. Nowadays, so it's difficult for us to understand these things.
So next question.
Yes.
Dimly lit Garbhagrihas with narrow avenues of access, visually or otherwise, is the traditional architecture. Cannot this form of Garbhagriha made more open visually and structurally?
I think you already addressed that.
It. Yeah.
You already addressed that, I think.
I actually said, because it's like you can't put a breath into a womb. It's like making womb being enlightened. It is blasphemous also. I mean, in one way.
What is the importance of the Dvajastambha?
Absolutely. It's called, my God, you're asking for a completely different talk now.
This has changed. I think we've changed course here. We've changed gears and we've entered a different arena altogether.
I would say, but in a short, I would say it is also, it's also another linga. If one who can't get into the Garbhagudi and worship, they can just touch this one, Dvajastamba, pray to it, because the Dvajastamba itself is a temple by itself. It's a mandira by itself. That's why it's like a war field. It represents the war field. The Dvaja is like, it's like a fort. It's like a kota of the god, as if it's his governance. It's his capital city. That's the Dvaja becomes his main power. To it's a place of power where Brahmasthanam, where the Brahma is reside, not necessarily the Chaturmukha Brahma. The word Brahma also means center. The center of his space is there. Energy is concentrated there. It is a shrine by itself. This much I would stop it. And there are many interpretations to it. I have to say that Dvajastamba in all the temples more or less resembles the flag mast of a ship.
Wow.
I'm giving an indicator to there because we are in mid of a cosmic ocean.
Ocean, right.
It's a deluge. I don't want to get more into it. Yes, please.
Question will take from Sushma Banerjee.
Yes.
Please unmute yourself.
Namaskaram.
Namaste.
I had a question. While we have heard a lot about the structure or the cosmic nature of the Indian temples, I just wanted to know which other culture or another country, continent shares similar thoughts or architecture, and if there is another one, how does that connect? Who traveled where, and how did those ideas come about to match? And also, I would request that this be one of the many lectures from Sir, because I think it's just opened our minds to so much more. So, Pujita ji and Shivani ji, please, if this could be, and we will make sure we are available, because
repetitive feature.
We are just going to want to hear so much more from Sir.
Thank you, madam. But I had to say, spot on, easy reply. All the ancient civilizations had this thinking, not one. It's so amazing. Egypt, direct answer to you is Egypt. Chinese civilization, if at all there's a separate civilization in China, Sino civilization. Greek civilizations, Arabic civilizations, Southeastern, entire Asian civilizational culture, till Korea, till Japan, all the architecture has same fundamentals. In any of the ancient civilizations, you find ancient architectures, everything was revolving around human body or universe. Even you go to Stonehenge in Europe. All the prehistoric structures had an affinity to cosmos. There is a kind of a link with the human and the cosmos, the sun and the moon, the stars, the reading of it, and the human body. Even in the Mayan civilization is a direct link to South Indian civilization, even in terms of language and culture and food. South American culture, calendar especially.
Calendar is very similar.
And many cultures we are similar. And the most famous is ancient Greek and ancient Egyptian. There are a lot of shocking similarities. I can say it'll make our jaw drop. So much similarities are there in terms of naming of gods, the mythology, the structures, the culture, so much so.
So I think, JC, there was, I mean, if I may, there is a lot of evidence now that there was a lot of travel out of India of groups of Indians from India to these areas. So, for example, there is growing evidence that the Jewish tribe was actually Indian in origin. There's a lot of mention of that. The Armenians, for example, there was a king from India who traveled to Armenia and set up. Similarly, there was a group of people, I'm forgetting the name, who apparently way back in the BC, traveled to Greece, and they are believed to have been the original settlers there who started the whole Greek,
culture.
Yeah, so therefore you find a lot of similarities in the Greek mythology and the Indian mythology.
Yes,
like Mitannis, like you mentioned, Mitannis from Syria were the direct, direct predecessors of the Egyptians. So this was what is now being called the out of India theory is being, talked about.
Out of India theory.
Yes, so a lot of genealogical evidence is coming out that it actually emanated from, that is why it's
India.
called the cradle of civilization.
I mean, absolutely. There are many people who argue it is the southern part of the India, a whole lot of land got submerged in India. There are many, many theories which are feeding into many research and furthermore. Yes, there are a lot of work been happening, and we all know the civilization thought getting unearthed in the banks of River Vaigai in Madurai area and Kiradi, as they say. They also correspond to a lot of parallel thoughts in terms of civilizational thinking. So this movement of ideas, if there's a migration of ideas from one place to the other, I think this has been a favorite topic for prehistoric researchers who all research this part, and most of them concur with the idea. Yeah, their research results were like this. Absolutely. Thank you, Pujita.
One last question. Why do we have erotic, amorous figures in temples like Konark and Khajuraho?
Absolutely. See, these eroticism is, to be very honest, to see them as something which is very far away from reality, or see this, sorry, I might sound a little, because the question is sensitive, I have to say this. I think as time are growing, we have become far more sensitive to something which is very, very natural, number one. We are trying to hide it under the carpet, and perhaps it's a borrowed civilizational thinking being imposed on us because of our schooling. I mean, we have been schooled for at least for past 2 centuries in some other order, comfortably, most of us, and we are very comfortable in that schooling. And our own schooling becomes a little alien to us. We are far more, perhaps Indian, most of us are familiar with maybe Keats and Kelly and Yale rather than Kalidasa. We don't know how many work Kalidasa did, most of us.
Absolutely.
And we are not familiar with Kabir. We don't even know the names of the Dasa poets of Karnataka. Why even in Telangana, how many poets, and we don't know, we are not sure, but we are familiar with many other poetry. This is because of a schooling. I would say that as we are also schooled to understand that nudity is something very offensive. I mean, to be comfortable with one's own body. Till recently, men were working half naked, if you wish to call, half naked. At the upper part of the torso, we never wore anything. The lower torso, it was just with thin, based on the climatic conditions, very thin cotton clothes and silk clothes were worn. Hardly anything to cover on the top, but just if not for a cloth. Women never wore much. It was many women were comfortable without, just with the drape of a sari, they were comfortable. Many worked with that up and down, getting up, getting down, climbed on the trees, did their farming with all the Now the question is, suddenly we become uncomfortable in looking at the body. I mean, there is some kind of, many things, even in terms of union, male and female union, songs are so out. I mean, how many of us even remember many folk songs, many dancers, we have a thing for padams and all. Many songs were in the tip of the tongue for many people to sing about union, about love, about sexual, conjugal union. Songs were there. I had to say this. We have a habit of even praying to the Lord. Early morning, we get up and we had a habit of making children recite something to Venkateshwara Swami as a Suprabhatam. Kamala kucha chuchuka kunkumato niyatarunitatula nilatano kamalayata lochana lokapate vijayi bhava venkata shailapate, which means, oh, the Lord who has smeared kunkuma, which is from the breast of the Alamelumanga, please get up.
Beautiful.
You are lying on the bosoms of the goddess. You are doing Suprabhatam to the Lord, who's sleeping on the bosom smeared, on which kunkuma's lepana has been happened, and that has been stuck to your forehead. Oh Lord, get up. I mean, what is not erotic than this? And it has been asked to said by every single child in the morning. Absolutely. We come from such a culture. And where things have gone wrong? Is it our way of looking at that particular act? Are we hiding it under the carpet? Or are we even made by constantly hiding under the carpet? Sorry to say, we have made pregnancy to be a disease today. And many of the ideas of reproduction, which is so natural to us since generations before, to have so many children, couples, I mean, practically many of them finding to have difficult to one child. and they're spending lakhs and crores on it. I'm not joking. They are very serious issues where we have completely have a very cloistered idea on the idea of conjugal union, or even sexuality, or even gender. This has become far more. See, these are harder truth for a Western thought, for a Western commoner. I'm not even comparing this. I don't want to use the word Western. Rather, I wish to use the word modern. Anyone who's modern have problem in handling these terms. All of us are modern. We are products of modern thinking, and most of us are not easy in handling the idea of union, idea of gender, idea of third gender, idea of sexuality, idea of sensuality. All of this is to be taken away from children. That is the modern way of looking at it.
So well said.
I bow to Parampara, Vishwa, and JC as three lingas today who offered yourselves on this.
Thank you, Lavanya. Thank you so much.
Day. The explanation you gave for the last question, at this moment, yes, it has made us so comfortable. What else we want? This has been an eternal question, no? And it has been, in the modern terminology, if I have to use, it has been screwed up.
Absolutely.
Isn't it? So I have a question or a doubt, whatever. It may be very rudimentary, or
please go ahead.
Please go ahead with the question.
Very, very amateur also, but I had it in it occurred to me. When you said Garbhagraha, it talks about, it's a symbol of uterus, icon of uterus. What occurred to me is, which stage of the uterus, what is the condition of the uterus there? Because when you talk about the male organ, I mean, going into it, the depth of it as a source, there is no doubt for us. I mean, no doubt in the sense, there are days when the male organ, the internal body, could be source of it, source of what is coming out of it. I have very less knowledge about it, but according to the uterus, it's very obvious when you talk about the uterus. What stage of the uterus is that?
See, the fact of the matter also lies that it is ever pregnant, and it is not a growing fetus. It's not a changing fetus, and it's as if, see, the moment you agree with the fact it is growing, then that is something is different from the previous second to the next second. We are speaking about non-growth and eternity. It is not something which is of flesh, of ever-changing flesh. It is of a ever non-changing eternal spirit. In that instance of memory, see, it is, I had to say, it is an edified memory of the mental instances, what's happening when when male and female come together. Then that particular spot can be edified, when we can capture that memory instance, not the act. Where at that time they say that time stops. Time stops, and a very perfect moment is that if you make an island of that time, that is called Kala Dvipa. Kalam becomes an island at that particular moment of union. That is getting architectonified into a Garbhagudi. It is not anything to do with physical. Why I say that this is more it is, that instance is timeless, and it is present in all of us. That particular capacity to make time timeless is hidden within us without any sadhana. If at all we are worshipping, only that capacity which is latent within us, which make time stops. And that is the source of another being. That's only a effect of it. It is a time installation. Garbhagudi is a time installation. I hope I answered your question. It's not an act, it's a time installation. It's not a physical representation of anything. The Garbha, idea of Garbha there is not necessarily Garbha of an actual fetus alone. It's a time instance they are trying to capture. Is it okay? Lavanya, are you there?
Yeah, she's there. She understood.
Yeah, sure.
Yes.
Yeah.
So thank you so much, Sri Jayachandra Garu and Pujita Garu.
My pleasure. Thank you, Pujita. Thank you, Shivani
Thanks,
Garu.
JC.
Thank you. Wonderful to have all of you all the audience who have come. Thank you so much for the time. I mean, it's been so beautiful that such an initiative has been taken that this can be, some of us can have a discussion, a forum to say this material. And with all folded hands, I wish to pray to all the people who have given me this wisdom, especially Shivamapati Acharya, Shivirinathan Acharya, and the great people, the great living knowledge storehouses of the temples of India. Whomsoever we meet, we have, and especially me, of the peoples of Chidambaram, peoples of Tiruvarur temple, peoples of Tanjavur temple, peoples of Kumbakonam temples, who have shared their knowledge with me so willingly. To all of them, my pranams. They are my, ever inspiring. I don't call them as books. They are kind of inherited knowledges. They are inherited. They
They're
are
your
heritage.
gurus.
They are my gurus. To this Guru Purnima, I fall at their feet so that I can share a drop of the nectar what they have shared with me. Thank you, Srivani Garu, so that this was a forum, a window, a sabha, a sadas, in which this congregation of this particular charcha can happen. It's a dharma charcha. I would not call it as a lecture. It's a charcha within the mind of everyone who is listening. What is dharma and what is adharma in this given subject? I mean, if something has been alleviated, because the word guru also refers to one which removes darkness. If there's some adharma has been little shifted, I think me and Pujita have done something to them.
You, JC. I was just facilitating it.
Thank you so much. And Srivani Garu, you are the Karta today, you are the Karana today, and you are the Karya, and you are the Karna today. Thank you so much for the entire organization of Vishwa Talks, and I would say to the Parampara Foundation, who have come together to make this possible on a Guru Purnima day.